So, Migkillertwo has made a video on abortion, which, strangely enough, has almost nothing at all to actually say about abortion, but instead relies very heavily on the notion of mind-body dualism. And I think that his overall argument fails on multiple levels, but to fully understand why, I have to give a brief primer on mind-body dualism, and that's what this first half is going to be on. I'll make a second video that addresses the specific flaws of Migkillertwo's argument. Okay, so for starters, what is mind-body dualism? The basic notion is the idea that there are two fundamental different aspects to human beings, or to persons. There's the physical aspect, the body, which includes everything you see here, and there's also a non-physical aspect, which we term generically the mind. This non-physical mind is responsible for the various aspects of consciousness, including things like perception, memory, feelings, emotions, and personality. Mind-body dualism has a very impressive pedigree in the history of philosophy, dating back at least as far as ancient Greece, including people like Pythagoras and Plato, but it really reaches its apogee in the philosophy of the 17th century French philosopher René Descartes. Several of the arguments that Migkillertwo make he borrows from Descartes, and indeed his ideas are very, very venerable and estimable and impressive and thought-provoking and worth studying, and are rightfully at the center of a lot of philosophy of mind, even to the present day. At the same time, though, most philosophers of mind, and I think philosophers in general, reject his arguments for a variety of reasons, the single largest of which is called the mind-body problem. And this is a problem that René Descartes was aware of. It was actually brought to his attention by his contemporary Thomas Hobbes, who was, of course, a materialist. And the basic question is this. Okay, so you have these two separate spheres. You have the body over here and the mind over here. How exactly do these two things interact? Now notice, it seems pretty clear that they do interact in some capacity or another. I, for example, can ingest alcohol into my body, and then my mind gets drunk. So there's some sort of causal interaction between the body and the mind, and the mind-body problem asks, how exactly does that interaction work? Now, notice something. If all there is the brain, and the physical body and the brain, there are some mysteries here, but they're not terribly profound. I can explain at least the basics of what happens when you get drunk. You ingest alcohol, the alcohol goes into your stomach, it's absorbed into the stomach lining, gets into the blood, blood carries it to the brain, various chemical reactions and so forth go on in the brain, and that's what causes you to get drunk. Again, it's not perfectly clear and easy, but at least we have a general idea of how it works, and we know how to study and how to figure out all the extra added details by looking at the brain. But if there is, in addition to just the body and the brain, a non-physical mind, there's a strange extra question going on here. Okay, so it goes, alcohol to stomach, stomach to blood, blood to brain, and then brain to mind. How does that last step work exactly? How is it that the alcohol transmutes from the physical part of the brain to the non-physical part of the mind? René Descartes, for the most part, blew off this problem, and he seemed to think that future scientists of the mind would be able to figure it out. He actually went and carved open the corpses of several dead bodies and took a look at the brain, tried to figure out what the answer to the mind-body problem was, and what he came up with was the pineal gland. Pineal gland is a small walnut-shaped gland sort of in the middle of the brain, right about there-ish or so. And he didn't just pick it at random. He looked at the brain. He didn't have powerful microscopes or anything like that. And the pineal gland appeared to be the only part of the brain that only macrostructure of the brain that straddled both hemispheres. And he reasoned, well, whatever it is that's doing the thinking, the consciousness, has to somehow connect both hemispheres, because our consciousness is not bifurcated the way our brain is. So wherever the consciousness is going on, it has to be going on between the two, and the pineal gland looked like the right place to him. It was a noble effort, but at the same time, of course, we know today that it's false. Pineal gland actually has nothing at all to do with consciousness. And we know this because you can actually physically remove the pineal gland from the brain and the person is still conscious. They have all sorts of other problems, of course, because the pineal gland is important for hormone regulation and other sorts of functions. I can't remember exactly what it does. But it's clearly not essential either for life or for consciousness. So he was just empirically wrong that the pineal gland has anything to do with the mind interacting with the body. But more to the point, even if he had been right, even if that was the seat of consciousness, it really doesn't answer the question. Because the question isn't where does the mind interact with the brain? It's how does the mind interact with the brain? That's the real mystery. It seems like we are entitled to some sort of explanation. We're entitled to a story that explains why it is, I mean, to use another example other than being drunk, why is my consciousness tied to this body? Why is it that I can only see out of these eyes? Now again, notice that if it's just the brain, no mystery here. The reason why I can only see out of these eyes is because my brain is only connected to these eyes. But if there's also a non-physical mind that's somehow tethered to this body and this brain, then we have a real mystery. Why is that non-physical mind stuck to just this one lump of flesh right here? Why couldn't it, hypothetically at least, unhook itself and, astral project somewhere out and see the world, from another point of view? Why is that? These seem like reasonable questions if there is a non-physical mind. And René Descartes' mind-body dualism simply just seems incapable of answering them. And it wasn't just Descartes, of course. The intellectual luminaries who dealt with this problem and followed in Descartes' wake wrestled hard with it. People like Leibniz and Spinoza and so forth. And they came up with variations and very, very clever modifications, but ultimately none of them were terribly satisfactory to any sort of large body of thinkers, due in large part for pretty much the same reason. They, like René Descartes, were just making shit up. It was an understandable habit at the time because they really didn't know the first thing about the brain or how it worked. And if you can't access something through empirical evidence and science, really all you're left with is the imagination. And René Descartes actually really admits this. He admits as much, that all of his ideas are not based on any kind of empirical sensory experience. And because he throws all that stuff out the window in his meditations when he's developing these ideas. So all these ideas come just from the imagination, from the mind of René Descartes alone. And the problem with doing philosophy that way is that it turns out that the imagination is just a really poor guideline to the way that the world actually works. The imagination has led us to all sorts of mistaken, problematic ideas. Imagination is a great tool. It's a great place to start when you're trying to get ideas about the world. But ultimately, that imagination has to somehow connect with the world in which we live to have any traction. And René Descartes made it impossible for his ideas to actually do that. And when it came time for the 19th and the 20th century to come around, and the early neuroscience started to develop, this really just shot mind-body dualism straight to hell. Things like the case of Phineas Gage, which some of you might be familiar with. Gage was a guy who had a iron rod blown through the frontal part of his head, and it completely warped his personality. And it gave us a lot of insight into how exactly it is that these various aspects of consciousness, things like memory, the emotions, perception, and personality, really are all connected right here. We can explain all of this stuff, not in as high-resolution detail as we might like, but in some detail at least, by pointing to certain parts of the brain, saying, this part here is responsible for that, and this part here is responsible for that, and this network that scans across here is responsible for that. All of this stuff, which used to be pure mystery, now is explicable in terms of the central nervous system. So, by and large, serious thinkers have abandoned mind-body dualism in favor of some form or another of materialism, simply because the immaterial mind is otiose. We don't need it to explain anything. Now, that's the general primer on mind-body dualism. Now, I'm going to turn to the second video. I want to speak more directly to the particular arguments that Migkillertwo has made.